Okay, so we got about 50 minutes here, and I tend to be very wordy and run long, but I have decided not to really bother with the slide deck much today. So you're in luck, or maybe you're not in luck, I don't know. But anyway, I am Chris Love, and hopefully if you've been around the Philly Code Camp long enough, you know who I am. But just in case you don't, I specialize really in progressive web apps. I also have a foot hanging in the online marketing SEO world these days, and I help companies out with that too. But my main primary focus is progressive web apps, and my preferred vertical stack altogether is building serverless backends in AWS, static websites, and very, very thin, very, very fast web applications focusing on progressive web app technology. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with progressive web apps yet. The concept, or at least the term, has been around probably since late 2014, but I really started developing web applications using the architecture of progressive web apps, or the way we built progressive web apps. I started building web applications more or less in this vein back in the 2010 timeframe, as I was starting to kind of see how things were taking shape, especially with the revolution of the smartphone world, and iPads were coming out, and it was ever apparent that the way that general consumers and line of business was doing online work was changing, and the expectations of user experiences were changing. And being somebody who's extremely passionate about the web, and realizing the web really didn't have really wasn't something that needed to go away in the place of native applications. I could see how to build web applications that rivaled native applications. And fortunately, the web, which was fairly behind at the time, has done a lot to really, really catch up in that time frame. And thankfully, the great engineers at Google and Microsoft and some over at Mozilla and Samsung really teamed together and have really pushed the web forward a massive amount over the last 10, 12 years in particular. And part of the product of that is what we now classify as a progressive web app. Really, progressive web apps are kind of a philosophy or a way of building web applications and leveraging modern APIs to deliver a native app-like experience using those web technologies. So before I kind of dive any deeper into that, I just want to go over a few things. If you got questions, post them in the chat. I've got it open over here on my other monitor, and I will get to it as I can, and I'll definitely try to answer those questions. If it's really something that really is confusing to you and you feel like you can jump in, just unmute your microphone and ask me a question. I don't have like a real massive structure for this today, but I do have a plan, let's put it that way. So if you feel like dropping me an email, feel free. It's chris@lovetodev.com, and Love to Dev is my website. I have a ton of repositories up on GitHub. I feel like I have more private now than I do public, but if you want to follow me on GitHub, it's GitHub/doclove. And I pasted a few links to some resources I have out there. One in particular is PWA Starter, and that's like an online kind of wizard, if you will, that you can walk through, and it will scaffold out kind of the initial files to get you started to upgrade a website into a progressive web app. And if you really want to kind of see me trying to teach Andy Schwam and Chris Gomez how to use it about 1.5 years ago, if you go to their YouTube channel, was it the Tech Guys or Dev Talk Show or whatever it is, they had me on there for an episode to kind of walk through using the PWA starter, and we had a lot of fun working on that one. Let's see. Anyway, yeah, it was pretty funny. It taught me a lot, honestly, in the questions that people have about this, because I kind of, I think I have an over assumption that people just understand concepts that to me are just kind of obvious, and I think a lot of us suffer from them. So when I get that feedback, which is something I definitely look for from you today, it helps me understand how to explain these concepts better because they make a lot of sense to me, and I do try to be an advocate for progressive web apps and using the web to solve problems and do it efficiently. So I do have a few slides that I'm just going to kind of dive into, but what I want to do, I just want to kind of quickly kind of touch base on the concept of progressive web app. Now, at a very high level, what this means is that you're using the web to build app-like experiences. And there are certain expectations that we have for something to qualify as a progressive web app. And there are three technical things that you have to do before you can qualify. And the first one is the website has to be served using HTTPS, or Hypertext Transport Secure Protocol. Protocol security with a TLS certificate. And statistically, it's very rare you find a site that's still using HTTP. Some sites don't really qualify, even if they are using a certificate, because they are referencing unsecure URLs in their content and things like that. I could go on for a whole hour or more, easy, on HTTPS, and doing upgrades and stuff. But I do encourage you to, if you're not already HTTPS, definitely go do it. Certificates are free these days. They're easy to set up. Let's Encrypt is fairly simple if you're on like a Linux or something like that. I use AWS, and their certificate thing takes literally less than 30 seconds to create a wildcard certificate and then have it applied, and then go through and apply it to my CloudFront or CDN endpoints on there. So there's really no barrier for HTTPS, whereas like 25 years ago, their certificates for like $100 a year. They took a week or two before you got authentic, verified, before you could get the certificate, and yada yada yada. Literally, it's 30 seconds these days, and it's so much easier. The next thing you need to have is a valid web manifest file, and there are a lot of little properties in there. Essentially, this is metadata that's describing your application to the browser or the platform. And one of the key elements of that is having a set of icons that can be used for the home screen or start menu. Now, it's one of the real advantages of using my PWA starters. It will generate a full set of like about 110 different sized icons and sort it out, essentially identifying different platforms and what they're looking for, because there are differences between Android, there's differences in iOS, Windows, and things like that. And so it goes through, you upload your logo, and I advise you to upload like a square logo. I have some upgrades planned for it. One of the things is I need to change it so that it's making what we call maskable icons, because the platforms are have kind of migrated in the last less than the last year or whatever, to really require kind of a buffer, because they're starting to do this circular icon things with the background and stuff these days. So I got to kind of update that a little bit. That's kind of key. Even it looks like, I'm not going to swear to this because Apple has not been open about this, and Apple's never open about anything, honestly. It looks like iPhone's Safari on iPhone is actually reading the web manifest file rather than the Apple Touch icon meta tags and things like that these days as guidance for how your application should be described. So that's good. The other browsers all use the web manifest file, and there's different things like name and description and what orientation, like landscape, portrait, that you're looking for, full screen, or you still want the address bar. Those kind of affectations you can describe in there, and those will kick in when the application is added to the home screen. Now, in Chrome and Edge, there's also an advantage there because they have a native event that you can hook into that will allow you to control a native prompt to the user to ask them to install your application. If your website qualifies as a progressive web app in the eyes of Chrome and Edge, and even in Firefox on Android and Samsung Internet on Android, the address bar will show some sort of icon and usually some sort of little animation up there on the top right corner to kind of hint to the user that they can install the application. And the nice thing on Windows and Android is when you do install a progressive web app, it is essentially hooked in just like you had installed a native application as far as the plumbing. So you can actually go to like the uninstall process, like with a regular desktop application or whatever. And you can put the icon in the start menu. One thing I have noticed is that Windows is finally starting to honor those icons as full tiles lately. So that's like good news. They had that working better before Edge came out, and they deprecated Internet Explorer. They allowed you to have even live tiles and stuff. They're slowly working that back in. There was some internal political and technical issues they had to get over to make that work, but it works the same whether it's installed from Chrome or from Edge. And things like Chrome OS, which a lot of our kids are using on Chromebooks and stuff, they are deprecating their app store in favor of progressive web apps, for example. And you are starting to see a lot of big companies really start switching. I saw, I think it was this week or late last week, that Microsoft is phasing out the classic Office applications in favor of their progressive web app versions. And I can attest that I've been using Outlook as a progressive web app for almost a year now, and I literally don't know any difference between that and the desktop app. Other than right now, it doesn't seem like it's still registered as the default handler for like calendar cards and stuff like that. But I think that's going to change, because that is something that's available to us these days, is to register as a file type handler. And then finally, this is what we're really going to focus on today, and this is the kind of the big secret sauce for progressive web apps, is the service worker. And the service worker is kind of the real muscle to make a progressive web app. Now, what a lot of people really look at as progressive web apps as well is all the other APIs and features that the web offers. And a lot of times you'll see people saying that the web doesn't do X, Y, or Z. And I feel like I have to constantly write articles or expand articles to denounce that, basically. For example, I have worked with low-level USB connectivity, Bluetooth. I've been using the camera for a decade in the web, using that quite a bit these days. I have a lot of people asking me for camera and microphone access. We've got real-time video channels. In fact, Microsoft Teams, when it was first released as Microsoft Teams about 3 or 4 years ago, was released as a progressive web app. And you may or may not realize that. But everything you do in Teams, Skype's got a progressive web app. Google Maps, Google Photos is a progressive web app. These are things that I actually have and I use day to day, kind of things that I can think of off the top of my head. A lot of these things I've forgotten that are progressive web apps. Hulu, Netflix, Spotify, those are all progressive web apps. You don't need the native applications. It's the exact same code base as the native app is what's in the progressive web app. So there's a lot of precedence right now for progressive web apps. And one another huge advantage, and this is what people have been calling me left and right for the last 3 years, is you do not need an app store. You can avoid the app store. And the reason why businesses more and more want to get away from the app store is they do not want to have ambiguous and constantly changing rules that get them kicked out, or their updates not deployed for various reasons. I've had so many customers say that they made a change, it got deployed, they found a bug, they made another bug, they fixed that and then deployed it and got the application yanked out because another auditor decided that it didn't meet some ambiguous criteria. And Apple, in their 4.2.6 statements, actually say it's like porn. We'll know it when it qualifies as an app when we see it, but we're not going to tell you what that means. The other side of it too is if you actually do online payments, Apple takes 30% of what you're charging, and nobody likes that. For example, Fortnite is in a massive war right now, which is Epic Games, with Apple and Google over their 30% policy, because they want to be able to charge users directly, and that will cost them about 1.5% to 2% rather than 30%, which means they can offer a discount to players to participate in the platform. Netflix actually pulled the ability to pay for Netflix out of their application about 2 years ago. So you have to go to the website, for example. So there's a lot of precedents. Spotify's got lawsuits filed against these guys. Hey.com, which is Basecamp, is fighting them. These are big public ones, but there are thousands of other small ones. And that's one of the key things that people are coming to me for. Progressive web apps are also fantastic for a lot of business because you do not need those stores, and you can deploy those internally just like you have been doing, like intranet type applications. So yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's talk about service worker. Now, when I was first introduced to the concept of progressive web app, the term was just coming about, I think, and I was actually at a conference in California, and I was the second presentation of the morning, and the guy in front of me was one of the Chrome engineers I'm friends with, the guy who made webpagetest.org, if you know about that website. And he was doing a presentation called The Proxy Server in Your Pocket. I didn't know what he was talking about. Service workers literally had only been announced about a month or so before this conference. And he got up there and showed service workers. And I realized as I was watching him, the session I was going to give right after him essentially had become a polyfill or was being deprecated because service workers really replaced all the architecture that I was doing to make my applications work offline and work really fast, because now service worker essentially made that native and also put it into a background thread off of the UI. So something a lot of developers don't realize is that each tab in the browser, as far as what's actually rendered on the screen for the user to see and interact with, has a single thread. And so if you've got a ton of JavaScript and doing a lot of JavaScript processing, that locks up that thread and it makes it unusable. So like if you ever try to click something and nothing happens, and then 10 or 15 seconds later something all of a sudden it starts working, it's because there's a massive amount of JavaScript being processed. And today, unfortunately, so many of the fast food frameworks that are popular are causing massive obesity in the web, is what I call it. 10 years ago, the average website was like 250 to 500 kilobytes. Now, people are bringing websites to me that are 10 to 50 megabytes in size and asking me why they're so slow. And I'm like, well, there you go. Lose weight, basically. Now, I've been building really big web applications for the last decade, and generally never get more than 200 or 300 kilobytes, most of them under 100 kilobytes of JavaScript. So you can do quite a bit with very little. And with the power of the service worker, you can actually offload a lot of that into a background task. Now, we've had web workers for quite a while, and honestly, I've never really got into those. The service worker kind of came out not too long after those came out, and so I really just started deferring web worker kind of concept work into the service worker a lot. Plus, the service worker offers a lot more benefits as well. So the first one, and this is the main area we're going to focus on today, is the ability to cache network request and data in the browser, so you can essentially run your entire website offline, the entire thing, if you really want to. Of course, it depends on the size. I don't advise you to cache the entire Amazon.com web application, if you will, in your browser, because that would be a disaster. But a lot of applications that I work on and build, it's no problem caching the entire thing. In fact, I have a few years ago I actually showed how to do the Philly Code Camp schedule application and make the entire thing work offline, and the entire thing renders in the service worker in less than a second. So it was a pretty nifty little trick, and I'll show you how that works in the context of my core demo application, which I really kind of been fast and furiously the last day, kind of clamping in some things because I haven't touched it in a while. But some of the other things the service worker does is it runs in the background, and it does not require that the browser even be open for it to do stuff. And the nice thing is you can schedule things, and I want to show you how to use the background sync API as well as the periodic background sync API to kind of trigger some things. Another feature, if the user opts into it, is you can send them native push notifications. So if you've gotten annoyed, like I still haven't figured out, I thought I'd turned them off, but I still get annoyed with push notifications from Netflix, for example, telling me that there's a new show that's been published that I might be interested in, which I never am. But you know what I'm talking about. Here lately, I'm ordering more stuff to pick up and take out, and I get push notifications from a lot of those things telling me that my order is ready, or what state it is as far as being able to go pick it up and things like that. So those are general examples. A lot of companies really want to be able to do push notifications because they want to like nudge you into buying stuff, and it's a marketing thing. And I understand that, but at the same time, you got to be judicial about that. Unfortunately, Apple doesn't want to participate, and ironically, they're the ones that create the concept of a push notification. They also do not support the background in the periodic sync API, but that's okay. We can essentially polyfill that to a certain degree. And I have helped some companies that have internal stuff that was only on iOS, so like iPads, for example, and allow them to build their applications to handle a background sync of data that their employees were trying to post to the server. So essentially there's like a synchronization effort that goes on at that point. The other thing too is you can essentially offload logic. You can post messages back and forth from the UI to the service worker to trigger different states and background processing and things like that. And I'll kind of show you a little bit about that. So with further ado, I'll just give you some quick visual things, and then we'll kind of jump into some code here. So traditionally, we've got this classic web server type thing where we've got a web page in a browser, and it talks to the web server. And when that's been around since I started working on the web back in '92. No joke, really. I wrote my first web page in '92. But with the service worker, you essentially have kind of your own little environment that you can control in the browser. And you don't necessarily have to connect to the web server to do stuff. And the service worker will allow you to intercept all network requests and decide what's going to happen with them. And that really gives you the power to do some pretty cool things. You can, for example, just pass the request onto the server and send the response back up to the web page, and the UI can just do what it needs to do. Or you can do some sort of variation in complexity of actually caching the response from the server and then intercepting the next request for the exact same thing and pulling it from local cache, or go back to the network, or serve the cache version while you get a refresh version, various things. Honestly, I have come up with at least 3 dozen or more different what we call caching network strategies to handle different various things. Now, personally, I look at it as if it's a file, like an HTML, CSS, JavaScript, image, font file, those kind of things, I generally cache those in service worker cache. If it's data, meaning that that's when I'm hitting the API and I'm getting like JSON back or something like that, I tend to store that in IndexedDB. If I'm sending data to the server, I also cache that in IndexedDB if I'm offline or I can't connect to the server. So if you're not familiar with these two caching pieces, in a way they're somewhat similar. In fact, the early prototypes of the service worker cache were built on top of IndexedDB to prove the concept out. Now, IndexedDB is a document database in your browser. And so if you're familiar with like MongoDB or Elasticsearch, or in the world of AWS, it's DynamoDB. They're all what we call document or NoSQL databases, and that's exactly what IndexedDB is. It's a very low-level API. Personally, right now, I use an abstraction library called Local Forage because it makes it a very simple API that looks like the local storage API, which is another storage mechanism that you can use in the browser. Really good replacement for cookies, by the way. The problem with local storage is it's synchronous, and everything in a service worker has to be asynchronous, meaning it's promise-based. And if you're not familiar with promises, I encourage you to go look up and find some things about, learn how to use promises. It is definitely a different way of mentally thinking about writing your code. And sometimes I feel like I trip over myself writing promise type structure. If you're familiar with async await, that's promises with a little more classical style to it. I use that from time to time. I'm not a huge fan of it because it makes me have to litter try catches all over my code, and I'm not a big fan of putting try catches in my code. Just a personal preference and style of doing things, I think. So IndexedDB is great for things like JSON data, but I also persist images that I've taken on the phone or that I'm trying to upload. If I'm offline, it's a whole lot easier to store those requests in IndexedDB than it is in Service Worker Cache. One of the key differences between IndexedDB and Service Worker Cache in these concepts or context is Service Worker Cache only allows you to cache a response, a network response. And the key, or the way you reference that network response, is by the matching request object. Now, that could just be a simple URL or things like that. But it's essentially a key hash key kind of store, but it's only available for request and response objects. So it's very kind of highly optimized for those. Now, how much can you store in these? It varies, and there's no right answer. If you look at the specification, they left that open-ended, and they left it open-ended for a reason, and with good, well thought out reason
Hey,
behind it.
Chris.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that last part when you're talking about the key value with the
Sure. Well, I'll tell you what, I think it'll make more sense when we see it here in a minute.
Okay, great. Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah. No worries. Thanks for asking. Let's talk about the quota. So the reality is it depends on what's available on the device, and it also depends on the browser and essentially their what we call the evacuation strategy. When are they going to start tossing things overboard so the ship doesn't sink? Okay. Apple traditionally has always been very aggressive in limiting cache and throwing things over early. So when you write this stuff, always assume you're on an iPhone and assume that Apple's coming after your stuff. Okay, so never assume that your application's fully there. Always write so that even if the browser has decided to toss some of your stuff over, that it's kind of self-healing as long as you're connected to the network. Now, I have been able to store as much as 5 gigabytes on an iPhone. That was an iPhone 6 when I tested it. I just recently got an iPhone X. I haven't tested the storage on that. IndexedDB has always allowed us to store more on an iPhone. What I think Apple finally changed their policy to a couple of months ago was counting the entire storage quota as everything between Service Worker Cache, IndexedDB, and local storage. And so you should be able to, if it's a big enough hard drive with enough open space on the hard drive, you should be able to get up to, like I said, 5, maybe 6 gigabytes of stuff in there. And honestly, you shouldn't need that much space unless you're really storing media, like images or videos, to be synced with the server, or you've got an application like I built about this time last year. I was working on an application where it was a subscriber thing, and when you subscribed, we would download a bunch of videos for you to use as part of that subscription. And I think there was the typical subscription, you probably download 30 or 40 of these 1 to 4 minute videos. And it's actually the second application I built that did that. So in that case, those weren't terribly space consuming. I think the biggest batch was probably going to be somewhere in the 100 to 200, 150 meg would have been like the most, because those videos are fairly short. But like Netflix allows you to store movies and stuff for offline usage. If you get the 4K version of that, you're going to have problems. Something else that I have not played with, but I know is there, but I honestly don't know the broadness of the support, but I think it's pretty broad these days, is the ability to use the file system to persist stuff. But I have not had a reason to try that out yet, and I want to. I just haven't had enough bandwidth to do it. But it's there too. I just haven't had a chance to play with it, and I don't know what the limitations on that would be. If that's bigger, then you can store things, but honestly, if you don't have enough space on the disk, you're not going to be able to store it anyway. So generally, the quotas in the browsers work off the available disk space. And like if you've got, say, on my hard drive right now, because it's a brand new laptop, I've got 400 gigs of free space, for example. I might be able to store as much as 50 to 100 gigs of stuff for a particular web application. But if that gets down to like 100 gigs, that may go down to something in the 5 to 10 gigabyte limit or something like that. So never assume you've got unlimited space. Always assume that something may or may not be there, and just have a way to kind of heal yourself if you get my drift. Now, at the same time, you need to manage your invalidation of your data. So what I try to do is I try to have some sort of personal evacuation or invalidation based on a time to live or some of the headers of the files, which I'll kind of try to show here before we get done. So with that, let me kill the PowerPoint stuff, and what I want to do is get my mouse to there. It goes. I have a Bluetooth mouse and it likes to go to sleep if I don't use it. Okay, all right. So I have this demo application that I keep kind of working and bending for the last 7 or 8 years, and like I said, I hadn't really updated it in about 1.5 years, I think, and so I was kind of trying to put some of the latest things that I've kind of come across my path as far as building these applications and these service workers, and over the last day or so. But it's available at fastfurniture.lovetodev.com. It's pretty much the same thing I'm going to be working with here. There are some broken things in it if you poke around in it enough, because I'm kind of tinkering with it at the moment. I'm going to try to get this more up to speed with my standards as much as I can over the next few weeks. But the gist of this is it's a simple, basic e-commerce site. It's actually based on an old customer of mine from about 12 years ago that really bad story with them. But I had the full set of their catalog images, and so I just kind of built a fake catalog around that. Getting a 403. You know what? Let's fix it. I think I know why, because I just literally uploaded it, and I bet. Let's see, it's permissions. Yep, there it is. As that happens when I manually copy those over. Normally I have like a deploy script, but I hadn't got that updated yet, so I just copied them over by hand. So give it a second, it should work. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so the gist of this, like I said, it's a basic e-commerce site. Some of these links are not going to go hot because they're just not right, but it's just a kind of deal. Okay, so like this is a product one. I've got a basic contact form. We're going to kind of look at that down here in the footer because it's the only one I got wired up at the moment. But overall, believe it or not, I have 5,500 products in here. So it's kind of a giant mess. So here's a page that's not there. And here's the living room. See, they're not quite aligned. It's not up to my standards as far as the layout CSS stuff goes, but that's okay. We'll deal with that. Okay, because what we're going to be looking at is kind of in the back end. Now, when you do service worker development, you will live inside of the browser dev tools. And while Firefox has dev tools around service workers and some of the progressive web app features, they're just not as well developed. In fact, Firefox has just been laying off massive amounts of their staff over the last year, and they're switching to be a VPN security company is what it looks like. But as far as Safari, I don't know. I don't have a MacBook, so I can't debug anything in Safari. I can just like wildly hack and guess on the iPhone over here. But Edge and Chrome are identical code bases as far as the coding and rendering engines and stuff these days. So it's basically more or less the same. There are some subtle UI differences overall with the, like I can do the side stuff over here and the collections and stuff. Those aren't really matter of fact. The Edge team has really been adding a lot of features to the dev tools over the last year or so, and they're doing it in concert with the Chrome team. And now I live in Microsoft Edge's dev channel, and I think I feel like I uncover bugs faster than anybody else. But fortunately, I do have a dialogue with the guy who owns the dev tools. So like yesterday, I had the dev tools in offline mode, but the network requests are still going through, and then they weren't when they're supposed to be, and vice versa. So evidently I found a bug, and so he got his team working on it, and it was driving me nuts, which really can. Now, if you're not familiar with the browser dev tools, if you're a web guy, you've got to be familiar with these. There's these tabs I live in, these 4 tabs right here, console, elements, sources, network, and application. And applications where you're going to spend a lot of time as a looking at what's going on with your service worker, and then sources is where you're going to be debugging. This is essentially a debugger. Now, if you don't know, one of the very cool things you can do is you can map this to your file system, and that's actually mapped to a different one. We map this to our project today. Yeah, boom. And now you can literally edit the code in the DevTools, and it saves it locally, just like if you were in Visual Studio Code. And then there's a hook inside of Visual Studio Code to actually do the DevTools. The problem is it doesn't really like me using Dev Channel. It wants to use the standard edge. Yeah. Can you speak up a little bit? Can you speak up just a hair? Ah, okay, never mind. Okay, so I do this a lot when I'm working on one application. That way, if I make changes here, it automatically saves it back to my source files. And you can also change CSS. You can't change HTML though. That's the one thing I can't change in the sources tab though. So that's unfortunate.
Okay.
Well, I guess I probably could. I just don't edit it here. Yeah.
Are you, sorry if you already said this, are you using the Firefox Developer Edition?
No, I'll just have regular Firefox down here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the market share is fairly small in it, so I don't spend a lot of time in Firefox.
Oh, you're in, I'm just trying to see what you have open right now. I see it's DevTools, but like, is that?
Oh, no. This isn't. These are the DevTools in Edge, and like I said, they're almost identical to what's in Chrome. And to get there, you just hit F12 in your browser, or if you want to go right to a particular element, you can just right click and hit inspect, and it'll take you right to that element. And you can, the CSS and everything's right over here. And like right now, I've got it mapped to the file system. So you see the little green dot here. So if I change this property here, it'll save it immediately to the file. And so if I go back to Visual Studio Code, what I've changed here is what's actually in the VS Code as well. So.
Oh, nice. And you said that's an extension you have installed in VS Code.
There is an extension of VS Code that allows you to run VS Code sort of like this. However, it doesn't like me using Edge Dev Channel, and it always tries to open it up in regular Edge, and I'm always like confused. So that's one of the things that the dev team's going to try to work on, because I brought that up to them. So I don't actually use it that way. I do a lot of node debugging in VS Code, but I tend to live in the dev tools here to do the web stuff.
So cool, awesome.
So yeah, this is great stuff. And like I said, this is a debugger, and you can set breakpoints and stuff just like we always have been able to do. And whenever the script execute, you can break on that. You can also set breakpoints in HTML, and it'll hit that if the actual HTML element changes state. You'll see it actually break on that too. That's something I don't use a whole lot, but I know it's very useful. The network tab will show you all the network requests, and so you can actually see everything that's going in and out. And the cool thing is too, you can also see, did it actually go to the network, or did it actually come from the service worker instead? And they actually, the Edge just added a feature from the service worker panel that allows you to look at network requests that are just from the service worker, and so it filters it out. Basically, there's a filter up here on this. And this is kind of a little advanced dev tool stuff, but you can, there's all kinds of filtering stuff you can do up here. But this is the way to actually see. It says is service dash intercepted, and it'll only show you requests that actually went through the service worker, or actually were intercepted and returned from the service worker without hitting the network, if that makes sense. So I don't want to get too bogged down in that, but what I do want to show you is how to use this, because this is important parts. On the application tab, let's start here since we're talking about progressive web apps. They have a manifest tab on here, and my images, my icons are a little out of date, out of sync on this. But what it does is it shows you the properties that you've got set in your web manifest file. And so these are the fast furniture icons that I have that actually loaded. The other ones didn't. I gotta get this in sync, to be honest with you. But you can see I've got massive amount of things. Normally what I do for a real production client application is these larger tiles. I'll have a different image that I use so that it looks more like that, like a wide tile. I would have like this square logo with the actual fast furniture to the right kind of thing, make it look more like a real logo rather than just a square. So it just depends on what's going on with the particular application. And then the storage, this is sometimes not really accurate, if that makes sense, but it does show you like how much you've got cached in IndexedDB and then the service worker cache and overall. I'm not really sure where this is coming from. This always seems to be all over the place and it confuses people. Don't get bent out of shape about that too much. I'm not even sure the 6.2 megabytes in IndexedDB is accurate in this particular case either. It may be, but I don't think it is because I don't think I have anything really cached right now in IDB. Let's see if I actually do. No, I don't really. Oh, I do. Huh. I got that. This is all the products right here. So maybe that is right. Okay, let's go back up here. Now, this is the service worker tab. This gives you a little view of what's going on with your service worker. It's not that exciting, so to speak. If you want to see, if you go here, you can actually expand this and you can see all the service workers that are registered for all the different websites that have used a service worker. And if you're curious, service workers are limited in scope to the origin, which means in this case the domain, like fastfurniture.lovetodev.com. And so if I had app2.lovetodev.com with a different service worker, the fast furniture service worker could not talk to the app2 scope, and the app2 scope could not interface with the fast furniture one. And it's also limited to what path it's sitting on under that. So let's say if you had corporationx.com/HR and HR/HR had a service worker, then /finance could have a different service worker, and the two could not interact directly with each other. And that's all for security. That way you don't have like bad people like if a lot of websites reference third-party scripts and do it blindly, and you don't want them to jump in and actually kind of manipulate your application, if you get my drift. So that's one of the reasons why that's there. Now you can manually update the service worker by clicking that link, and what it does is it actually goes and loads the service worker. If you need to delete it, you can just click this and delete it and start fresh. I do that several times a day when I'm doing service worker work. If you want to toggle it in your application in offline mode, you just hit that. You can also do that from the network tab. I also have mapped some custom keystrokes to do it for me. If you are doing regular development, you're not working directly on the service worker, I highly recommend you hit this checkbox here for bypass for network. And what that does is it allows you to not worry about the service worker logic, but you can focus on the client side code that you're trying to debug. So like if you save it locally and then immediately go there and it doesn't update, go check and make sure that you're not loading the cached version through the service worker. So that hangs up people quite a bit. And if you're doing development and you actually are manipulating the service worker, writing code on it, this update on reload means every time you refresh the page or load a different page, it will automatically go get the latest version of the service worker regardless. And the reason why we do that is the service worker essentially normal has like a 24-hour cycle before it will check to see if there's a new version of it, because it doesn't want the browser to be constantly calling back home and creating unnecessary requests. Okay.
Chris,
Yeah.
Can you explain again that bypass for network? You just
yeah, sure. Okay, so if I do this, and when we get into the service worker itself here, let me show you. There are some events that you hook into, and there's a lifecycle. But this event right here, this fetch event handler, every single network request that's going from the UI to say the server or whatever is going to pass through this event right here. And this is where you have the power to determine how that network request is going to be handled. Now, when you check bypass for network, what you're doing is you are deactivating this event handler. And so all the network requests go straight to the server just as if you didn't have a service worker registered. So if you're working on UI code and you don't want like the locally cached service worker version of a file to be the one that's returned, and you want the one that you're actually just saved to your local host file system, you want to do that. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so that I see a lot of people like on Stack Overflow asking questions that basically they need to check that checkbox. So
Would that be like when you're working on updating the UI part of it?
yes, absolutely. So
Okay,
if I'm doing CSS or I've got client-side JavaScript I'm working on, or even change the HTML structure, that kind of stuff, that's exactly what I want to bypass the service worker.
great.
So
Thank
yeah,
you.
no problem. We're also going to look at the sync and periodic sync. They've got the ability for you to simulate those events. And wow, we're really pushing time here. We got like 10 minutes to get into the guts. Okay. The service worker cache. Now I've got 3 named caches here. Now I do highly recommend having multiple named caches. And like I said, this is the hook, essentially. This is the request. And as you can see down here, this is really the body of the response. And it gives you, this is just a visualizer of stuff, but you can see the headers and stuff like that, which I'm hopefully going to have time to show you how to use here. So, and then here's the IndexedDB, which is a key value store here because I'm using local forage, which makes it a key value store, but it's really a document database, so you can kind of store whatever you want, but local forage kind of manages that for us. So you can see here I've got different keys, and local forage, just you can look up that and its API. It's just set item, get item, and remove, basically for the API, and that's one of the reasons why I like it. It's simple. But here I've got, like I said, this is JSON data. This is the entire product catalog here, the data for that. So now let me dive into the service worker here. Now, there is a lifecycle that we have to be aware of, that when you register a service worker, there are 2 events that are going to kick off. First is the install event, which is this event handler. And here you can put some logic. And what I do is, generally I'd say skip waiting, because what happens is if you've got a registered service worker and then it registers a new version of that service worker, it's not going to change which service worker is, or the code is actually running in that service worker until the page is reloaded, or essentially all the pages or clients associated with that service worker are reloaded. So like if you have say a line of business application and you may have 10 tabs open to different parts of that application for a user, there's only one service worker that handles all of those pages. So there's not 10 service worker instances running. There's only one. And so they all have to essentially be refreshed. The skip waiting says it's okay, go ahead and move it to the latest version and you're not going to break anything, essentially. Generally, this is okay to do, but if you do have breaking changes, you don't want to do that. But that's another deal here. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pre-cache core assets of my application, and I have a full list of common files for the application here. And what's going to happen is this method right here will loop through, and it'll handle caching all these. Now, what I've got is I've got some logic here that looks to see, do I already have a cached version of this asset? And is that cached asset still valid? In other words, I haven't hit a time to live point in time kind of thing. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm looking at the header on the response, and generally you should have something like a date, which is when was that cached, and then a cache control header. You may also have an e tag. There could be a last modified header. These are all valuable hooks to kind of get an idea of how old the file is and if it's time to look for a new version of it. This particular one, I'm just using the date and the cache control because they were handy for this particular application. The date is when was the file saved, and the cache control generally says this is how long you should keep it. And this is with the classic browser cache, that's what it generally looks at. But this gives you complete control over it rather than leaning on that browser cache or maybe even a network proxy or a router or something that may have a locally cached version of it. Corporations have always been bad about locally caching stuff so that it doesn't go out to the network. What I'm doing here is I'm basically saying, okay, is this reached a point where what I've got locally cached has expired? And if so, go get the latest version of it. And I can put some more sophisticated logic in here if I want to. Now I'm also going to use the same exact logic here later on when I make a regular network request or like a product page that I don't have cached, as well as the image for the product or whatever, they're also going to fall through this and look to see if I already have a cached copy of it or not. And if I do, and it's still valid, return it from the cache. Otherwise, it is going to try to make the network request and deal with it from there. So this is kind of something new that I'm doing. It's something I've been wanting to do for a while that I hadn't enough bandwidth of time to really do it the way I wanted it to. But like I said, you can also check for the e-tag value and things like that. Kind of the nifty way that I don't have hooked into this yet to see if there is actually a new version or not is to make an HTTP head request. And if you make a head request, what you essentially get back are the headers, and then you can look at those values to see if those headers reflect a new version of the file or not. And that's really handy. Instead of, say, requesting a 200 kilobyte image, you can make a 2 kilobyte head request to see if that image has actually been updated or not. And if it has, then you can actually go through the process of updating your cache and refreshing it. We are going to run out of time here. Some of the other things I really wanted to show you. Okay, like I said, all this code's up there, but one of the things that I try to do in this application is render the site. Now, like I said, there's 5,500 products here, so I thought I'd actually see if I could render the entire application. And I found out that it really slows the application down. So you don't want to cache 5,000 files in your service worker cache. I've got to look into why that's suddenly slowed everything down. But I think it was just too much work for it to sift through the cached records to see if there was a match. I think that's really what it was. So, but if we go over here and we look in my service worker cache, which is here, this is the one where I've went ahead and cached 100 products just to show, but I've got all the category pages here. So this is the dining room. We can go preview that, and it's going to give us the preview. The CSS isn't applied here. It's just the HTML. And then here are some of the images. You can see this is a chair, and then if we just go down a little further, we get into the actual product pages. So if I actually hit these product pages, they're going to come from cache and not actually hit the network. So if I do this, you can see it's there. Now, if I go in here and go offline, I just went into offline mode. So another little nifty trick that I did is I grayscaled the entire thing, but that's a whole nother story. That indicates that you're offline. I tried to get a visual indicator to let you know you're offline. Oh, and it doesn't work. Well, that was embarrassing. That should have hit the cache. I wonder if I broke it this morning before I got online. Oh well. Okay. Well, I was hoping to go into other stuff, but like I said, I tend to ramble a little bit. But I'll tell you what, if you got any questions, let's go ahead and ask those questions, and that way I can maybe direct you to it. And like I said, feel free to email me if you got questions about the source code that's up there. I am going to try to keep updating that over the next couple of weeks. So.
I have a question. I did like a little bit of dabbling into this a few years back, and
Okay.
something that like kind of just I guess like a moral kind of question is with like an app store, you can opt out of updates from different apps,
Okay.
but with a PWA, I got the impression from what I understood is like when you connect to the internet, you get those updates pushed to your phone automatically. So like the user doesn't really give consent to when they get an update to that PWA.
You know, that is a fantastic question.
Yeah, that's
no one's asked me that, but I really sympathize with that one. So that is something you would need to program into your service worker and application management. That's not built in by default to control that. Essentially, the service worker is a blank canvas for you to write the logic of things like that. So I could totally bake that into this, and I can make that essentially a user setting. And based on what that value is, I could determine how I'm going to present to the user that it's new. Now, what you can do is you could literally create another named cache with a version attribute on it, which is something I tried to do. If I actually expand this out, you can see pre-cache has version 5.0 here. A lot of times I do try to append the version number and use that name. So in that case, I could use like an active named version of the cache name, and as part of checking to see if an asset's in the cache, I can use only cache names with the active version. So I could have the newest version available, but it not be active. But that's something you would have to program. So, but I really like that thought. That's a very good one. Something I was hoping to actually show you today too. And the reason why I'm saying that is because what you just asked is something that no one's ever brought up, in my opinion, or at least to me. I've never seen anybody write about it. But something that hit me about last month was the customer I was working with. Their server died, and all of a sudden, I was getting my service worker was acting as if the device, my laptop or my phone, was offline, because that's the only way anybody's ever talked about managing offline, is assuming that the device is offline, the client device is offline, and they never talk about what happens if the server's offline. So I had to actually put some logic in there to kind of evaluate, is the server offline or is the device offline, and kind of present that differently and do some different things based on that, because we just no one ever had thought about their server actually going offline. But even AWS and Azure and the cloud platforms have problems. So like right before Thanksgiving, Cognito, which is the identity server on AWS, went down for a day, and that wrecked everything. So yeah, so that is a fantastic question. Also, good question. I get some creepy people ask me to do creepy things like, can the service worker listen to ambient noise and record it for me 24/7? No, no, no. So, yeah. Are there any other questions? Okay, well, I do encourage you to go look at that source code. I did push an update right before we got on here, and I am pushing that forward. There is a course tied to that. I also have a book out there. The publisher wouldn't let me use this for my demos in the book. They made me write 3 different applications, which I think made it a bit disjointed. And honestly, I think it's gotten a little bit outdated too, because it's about 2.5 years old now. Or actually 3, believe it or not, it's 3 years old now. Wow. But anyway, I'm going to try to keep this one more in line with what I consider current. The other thing too is the capabilities and stuff kind of keep emerging or keep pushing, because like the periodic background sync is something that's that landed sometime in the last 6 months or so, and I've been using that. And basically, what you can say is, okay, when I register it, I'm going to you pass an interval. Like here, I'm saying I think this is every once a day. Check to see if there's anything in the outgoing queue that needs to be synced up, and try it. But I also use that now to do badges. There's a native badge API, so like the icon that's on the home screen can actually have a regular badge like we're used to seeing with native applications. But I also use that internally to like show how many messages are waiting in an application, those kind of things. There's a lot of ways that you can use this periodic background sync, and you can register different tags to make different ones different intervals, for example. So it's like a native polling without polling. But I use that to kind of trigger a periodic background sync. But if it's not there, I've got a manual way to do that. And so that's how I fall back on like iOS, for example. And then there's also the native background sync, which triggers if a device is offline and comes back online, it will trigger this background sync thing. And I essentially have it go through the same logic to go see if there's anything in the offline queue to do. But you can also have it check, essentially see, is there an application update or various things like that. So there's a lot of ways you can use these features to make your application better. So sorry I didn't get as deep as I really wanted to.
This is your favorite service worker interjecting here?
There you go. You're my push notification. Tell me I'm over time.
Yeah, you're almost 10 minutes over. So why don't you wrap things up? We're going to end this recording and session, and folks need to, there's 4 other sessions already started.
Okay, sounds great. So like I said, send me an email and check out the code and touch base with me. I appreciate you coming. Thanks.